Thanks for that introduction. Yes, so it's very confusing. We are a Georgetown affiliated research center, but we all work from different locations. So I live and work in New York City, but we work nationally with states and districts across the country, and we do both our own research into education finance issues, as well as work with those states and districts, often to help them with their funding formulas or other issues. So I'm just going to present a little bit of our work on states and districts that use what some people call weighted student funding, what we've been talking about today is student-based budgeting, what we call student-based allocation funding formulas. So our definition of what we call student-based allocation is just any funding formula that allocates dollars on the basis of students or student types, and the students are weighted according to need. So like I said, we do work with both states and districts, and so really student-based allocation can be happening at two levels. So you have your state and local federal dollars being allocated from the state level out to schools, and then of course districts allocating money to schools. So I'm going to start with the state to district level. So there are a few different states who have student-based allocation models. This is an example from California. They have their local control funding formula they just introduced a few years ago that they are rolling out. And this is their formula. This is how they allocate funding. They use different amounts based on grade level, and then additional funding is allocated to students who are limited English proficient, live in poverty, or in the foster care system. So that's just one example of what a state formula could look like. And in our research, we look at all of the funds, K through 12 funding at the state level, and look at how much of it is actually allocated out on the basis of students. So you can see California at the top is at 77%, and they're actually putting even more money into that new formula over time, so their number is going to go up. And we have Colorado. We have done this analysis in Colorado and found 83% of state funding to districts is allocated on the basis of students. Some of what isn't in there would be Colorado takes into account some district characteristics in that revenue number. We don't count that, but you can see from this there's huge variety in state funding formulas, and some of these states have almost no funding going out on the basis of students, and that's mostly because they're using a staffing allocation where they're allocating dollars on the basis of staff they think you should have, and maybe an operations budget, something like that. An interesting example is Pennsylvania. You'll see it's at 0%, and that's because Pennsylvania actually has no funding formula. They have been on a hold harmless since about 2008, where each district is just getting whatever that district got the year before. So regardless of whether they've gained or lost students, their budgets haven't changed. They are working on trying to pass a funding formula, so that's why they are at the very low number of 0. So some of what's in the percentage that's not student-based allocation, here are most of the different categories that that funding might be in. It might be funds for programs or delivery models, dedicated funds for schooling inputs, which is the case for most of the states with low numbers, like I said. Reimbursements, hold harmless funds. We also refer to that sometimes as phantom student funding, because you might have had funding for students who are no longer there, but you're still receiving the dollars. Small district subsidies, untamed local funding. Illinois on that analysis was at 18% student-based funding. If you were to look only at the funds they raise at the state level, it actually would be very high. They have a highly student-based formula. However, they have no cap on the amounts that local counties can raise. And so they have some very wealthy counties. So if you count all that local funding that's not student-based at all, that's why they're overall at 18%. So how the local and state funding is working together is obviously a big consideration in this analysis. And then you might have states making direct payments for pensions or benefits, or something like performance funding. So now I'm going to go quickly into the district, because I know most of us in the audience are more interested in talking about the district to school level allocations. Again, the definition is the same. It's still looking at where dollars, so not staff positions or other ingredients, are allocated on the basis of students. And this would be in contrast to most districts traditionally have had formulas where they're distributing purchase schooling items, like staff positions, supplies, books, etc., as opposed to just the dollars. This is just a list of some of the districts using student-based allocation, a lot of these that we work with. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive, there are many more, like the ones we heard from today, but this list will give you a sense that most of the largest districts in the country are now using student-based allocation. So I'm going to share some examples of the formulas because I think, as was clear from our presentations this morning, the actual formulas and details can look very different place to place, and it is really important how those details are decided. So this example is from Hartford Public Schools, and there are some things in here that are pretty common across formulas, like the base level amount differentiated by grades, again, like we saw in California. And then ELL and special education funding is often an additional weight. We see that across most of the districts with student-based allocation. But you can see here that Hartford has chosen to really differentiate students within those categories. So with English language learners, the additional funding you get for those students is changing over time, depending on how long they've had that designation. And then special education, there's a huge variety in the funds that might come with a student depending on which of these categories they're falling into. It ranges from, in the level 1, about $4,500 additional dollars, up to level 4, you're getting almost $23,000 additional dollars for students in that category. And then they also have additional funding for students who are below proficient and gifted. Another example is I took from Boston Public Schools. Again, some similarities with the different grade level base funding. And then this special education, again, very broken out. They have even more categories with many different levels of funding that come here, but a similar large range for those students. And they, one thing we definitely have seen, again, that like was talked about this morning, is that these formulas are going to develop over time, and you're likely not going to get the perfect formula in your first year. So something that Boston, for example, decided to add was this students with interrupted formal education. So for most districts across the country, this is probably something they deal with rarely, but for a district like Boston, they actually had a large number of students and found that those students had very large additional needs that should be supported with additional funding. So they have different grade levels for those C students. So that's a unique feature of their formula. And just one more I'll share with you. This is Nashville Public Schools. This is Nashville's first year implementing this across all of their schools. They had piloted it last year, and now all of their schools are on the student-based allocation formula. And again, you can see similar categories that they're funding. Additionally, they're looking at students' prior academic performance, their English language learning status, and then what they have here is exceptional education. So this includes for them both special education students and gifted students. And for their special education students, they're considering not just the identification that a student has, but also the number of minutes that that student is receiving special education services. And that was their way of trying to match the appropriate dollar amount to the student's needs. And we also see that in the Recovery School District in New Orleans. Similarly, their special education funding has a component where they look at the number of minutes that a student is served, because they found even when they had different funding amounts for different identifications, you can still have a wide range of needs within an identification. And so this was all about trying to get a formula that's really narrowing in on needs as specifically as possible. One thing I also find is interesting about the grade level funding is it's not consistent that the formula is always giving high school students higher funding or elementary school students higher funding. It ranges across the district. So I find that interesting that different districts see different needs for different grade levels to have higher levels of funding. So I won't go through all these because I think we've talked a lot this morning about what the reasons are that districts are choosing to move to student-based allocation. And these are the ones that we hear most frequently across districts, and I think they were all echoed this morning. So here's our analysis that we've done. Most of these are all of these, are from the 2013-14 school year. We haven't updated with the more recent numbers. But I think you can see that most of these districts are falling in the range of about 30 to 45% of their funding going through their student-based allocation formula. And just to be clear, this is a metric, so when we're looking at this graph, what we do is we take all of the district funding minus long-term obligations, so we take out any debt, funds, rainy day, or capital funding. The rest of that is the total budget that we're looking at. And then our numerator is any dollars allocated on the basis of students or student types. So that means this isn't a measure of dollars spent at the school level or dollars spent on students. Even some of these dollars could be spent at the central office. It's just a measure of how that money is being allocated from the district to the school. So just to show you those again, you can see obviously the recovery school district stands out here as a huge outlier at 100%. And that's because when they, as a relatively new district, they were able to have their district start with student-based allocation, which is much easier to put all your funds in there as opposed to if you need to move to it over time. So the way that they fund their central office is that all of their dollars are allocated out to schools on the basis of students, and then each school is charged a 1.75% fee from their budget that they pay back to the district to cover the district's central office services. So these are some of the issues that we hear districts most frequently either concerned about before moving to student-based allocation, or that they're still talking through the best way to deal with. And I think all of these came up in the conversation this morning. Do you use real or average salaries? Most of these districts are using average salaries, but a number of them their goal is to get to real salaries and are moving to that over time. New York City is an example. They have a formula that's sort of taking some real salaries into account and some average. Can central office functions be funded through the formula? Recovery School District is the only one that's doing that completely, but Baltimore, Milwaukee, some other districts have had central office services funded through student-based allocation. I think this morning was mentioned the chargeback. So the chargeback buyback model is where the district has some services that they would require schools to pay for, something like a superintendent's office that you can't opt out of as a school. But then they might have also optional services that they offer that schools can purchase out of their student-based allocation budget that they have flexibility over. Example of that we've seen is a grant writer. So a district had a grant writer on staff, and instead of requiring schools to cover the grant writer budget, it was a service that was offered to schools that they could choose to pay for that if they were interested, or if that was something they felt like they had someone on staff they could do themselves, they could use those funds for whatever other priorities they had as a school. What happens when a school's enrollment is lower than predicted? Something that came up again this morning. Obviously, schools, districts really have to think through the timeline. If you're asking schools to take on budgeting, what's your timeline for getting enrollment numbers, projected numbers? How do you deal with changes in that? Many different examples of how districts deal with it. Some of them have the carryover that gives schools some flexibility with that. Some of them can borrow from future budgets, and different options there. And what if you hold schools harmless? So many districts who want to do this are really concerned about how are they going to deal with schools losing funds. Often they'll have a hold harmless, like Denver mentioned that they had this morning. We've seen most districts having some form of that, but then removing it over time. And another one I didn't put on here, but I think was clear also, is that training principals and how you manage school staff taking on these new responsibilities is another huge issue for districts to consider. So this, just wanted to mention I have this handout if you guys are interested. I have paper copies of this. It's just a one-pager we put together that gives an overview of what student-based allocation is and some of the strengths and considerations around it. But that is all I have, and hopefully I can take questions from you all later.